So here we are, January something or other. Can't remember the day. I know I have a dental appointment today, and that's where we're at right now, the parking lot of the dental office. And I thought since I got here early, I would record a video. So, I'm going to approach this whole thing. In the last video, I talked about, how to define Christianity and, to reduce it to its like bare bones essentials or whatever. And so now for the rest of the videos, I want to make an argument for Christianity. And the way I'm going to do it is kind of like starting with these really broad claims about reality and then just narrowing it down to the specific Christian claims that I brought up in the last video. And so what I want to talk about today is, first of all, that you can kind of break worldviews. There are basically three different worldviews out there. There may be others that I'm unaware of. But they're idealism, naturalism or materialism, and dualism. Idealism is the idea that the only thing that exists are minds and perception. There's no physical world, just minds. And then materialism is kind of the opposite of that. It's that there's a physical world. Now, of course, naturalists don't believe that there are no minds. They just think mind is part of the physical world. But naturalists or physicalists or whatever, physicalism, naturalism, and materialism are roughly the same thing, but not exactly. Let me see if I can define these, and I'm sure somebody's going to disagree with me here. But naturalism is usually the view that the only thing that exists is the physical universe. There are no spirits, ghosts, or anything like that. You can argue about abstract objects. And then physicalism, usually that refers to somebody who's not necessarily a naturalist. They could be a naturalist, but what that means is more specifically that human beings are just physical things. In other words, we don't have immaterial souls. That's physicalism. So all naturalists are physicalists, but not all physicalists are naturalists. Materialism, I'm not sure. I guess materialism could fit under either view. So I may accidentally sometimes use these words interchangeably in this thing, but hopefully you can tell by the context what I mean by it. So there's idealism, and then there's naturalism, and then there's dualism. And dualism doesn't think that minds are the only thing that exists, and it doesn't think the physical world is the only thing that exists. It thinks both exist. In fact, dualism, broadly speaking, means that there's the physical world and there's also a non-physical world, and they're both equally real. Substance dualists, that's more a specific kind of dualism that says that human beings have both a physical aspect to their nature and a non-physical aspect to their nature. And the non-physical aspect is usually equated with the mind or the soul. The soul is like the seat of the self. In the Bible just uses the word soul. In Hebrew, I think it's nephesh. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And then in Greek, it's something like pneuma. And they both mean roughly the same thing. That just means self. And so to use the word soul does not necessarily mean that you're talking about like a spirit or something like that. I mean, even in our own vernacular, if you're talking about the Titanic, you might say so-and-so many souls died that day. That just means people, selves. So the word soul doesn't necessarily refer to an immaterial mind, but it can. And so, anywho, that's definitions aside. So it's really between those three worldviews. And there's a fourth one called panpsychism. And I don't know as much about panpsychism. Panpsychism seems to be kind of it shares similarities with both idealism and with physicalism, in the sense that I may butcher this. You may want to Google fact check me on this one. But panpsychists do believe that the physical world exists, but that the physical world is not fundamental. That mind is what's fundamental. And the physical kind of supervenes on the mind, I guess. I'm not really sure. But they believe that that everything that's physical has an underlying mental aspect to it. So, subatomic particles have a mental aspect to them. And that's kind of how they solve the hard problem of consciousness that physicalism faces. A lot of people gravitate towards panpsychism because of the difficulties of accounting for consciousness under physicalism. So I'm not going to talk a lot about panpsychism just because I don't know a whole lot about it. I'm going to mainly just talk about idealism, physicalism or naturalism, and dualism, specifically substance dualism. So I guess in this video, I mainly want to talk about idealism. I've written about idealism a few times on my blog, and there's a lot of things in those blog posts that I want to talk about in this video, but since I don't have an outline, and I'm doing this all off the top of my head, there's a good chance I'm going to forget some of it. So because of that, I'm going to leave some links in the description to those blog posts that I made. Without further ado, let's talk about idealism. So as I said, idealism is the idea that the minds are all that exists, and everything that seems like a physical world around us is just perception that exists in our minds. There are different reasons that there are different kinds of idealism that I'm not going to go into detail about just because I don't really know all the subtleties. I'm going to talk about one version of it that I'm familiar with. Okay, so one of the first arguments I heard about idealism is just that idealism follows if you apply Occam's Razor. Because if all of our perceptions, all of our knowledge of the external world comes by way of our physical perceptions, then those physical perceptions create, the perceptions only exist in your mind. And so if you can account for all of your perceptions just by reference to your mind, then by Occam's Razor, it's superfluous to suppose that there's an external world in addition to what's going on in your mind. One of the arguments against that is, well, there has to be something that's causing these perceptions, so it's probably a physical world out there that's causing these perceptions. And that seems to be the common sense view of things, that the reason it seems like there's a physical world out there is because there is one out there. To me, that seems like the most parsimonious thing to believe, that if it appears a certain way, it's because it is that way. So I don't think Occam's Razor really is a good argument, because we have this strong intuition that our senses correspond to an external world. And everybody assumes that the external world exists until they have reasons to think otherwise. It's always philosophy that talks you out of that, but the default belief that we all kind of hardwired to believe is that there really is a physical world out there. And for me, that's the strongest reason I reject idealism. I put a lot of can't think of the word, value. I put a lot of value in intuitive obviousness. So it's kind of like Zeno's paradoxes. In Zeno's paradoxes, there's like 4 of them that have survived. Supposedly there's a bunch of them. But they're all kind of work out as arguments against motion. And if there's no motion, then there's no external world. This is one of the earliest arguments against the existence of the external world. Parmenides, I think, also subscribed to this view that there was no external world. And I can't remember if Zeno comes first or Parmenides comes first. But anyway, you have all these paradoxes that supposedly prove that motion is impossible. And if motion is impossible and the external world has motion, that means that the external world is impossible. So the external world doesn't exist. Well, I think to most people throughout the history of philosophy have assumed that there's a flaw in Zeno's paradoxes. But there's been lots of debates on what exactly that flaw is, and nobody really agrees. And yet we all agree that there is a flaw. So this to me is owing to the fact that we all have this we have such a strong intuition that our senses correspond to a real external world, that even if we can't answer all the arguments against the external world, we're still rational in believing it. We still cannot shake this distinct impression that the external world exists. Another argument I've heard for idealism is that you can't describe the external world without appealing to something in your sensory experience. Like if I said the external world is green, or trees are green, or the sky is blue, well, I'm just referring to my perceptions of the external world. And the same thing is true with size and shape. I think John Locke made a distinction between primary perceptions, or primary properties, and secondary. I don't remember what the distinction was called, but basically there are some properties like color that only exist in the mind. They don't actually exist in the thing itself. And then there's other properties like size and shape that actually are properties of the thing itself and not just your perceptions. But idealists think it's all perception. And so one of the arguments is that you can't give a description of the world at all without appeal to your perceptions. I think that's a silly argument. And an analogy I came up with that I wrote about in one of my blogs is like, suppose I challenge somebody to give me a description of dinosaurs without using language. Well, obviously you wouldn't be able to do that. But that doesn't mean that dinosaurs cannot exist without language. In the same way, the fact that I can't describe the external world without appealing to perception in some way doesn't mean that it can't exist without perception. So that doesn't strike me as being a very good argument. Another problem, a big problem, I think, with idealism, or at least the kind of idealism that I'm thinking of, is that it seems to lead to solipsism or solipsism. I don't know, I've heard people pronounce it different ways. I say solipsism. I don't know whether that's correct or not. But that's the view that you're the only mind that exists, or you're the only mind you can know exists. If it's true that minds are the only thing that exists, that seems to create a big problem, because minds are first-person things. Everything that's in your mind, all your thoughts, perceptions, beliefs, preferences, they're all first-person private. And so if there are other minds besides your own, you have no access to them. You can only have access to other minds if there's some third-person way of accessing it. Like, through my mind, I can use my mind somehow to affect my body, and I can speak, and the sound waves go through a physical universe and get to somebody else, and they can catch what I'm saying to them, and then they can say stuff back to me. But it's all mediated through the third person physical world. If it's all mind, then I don't see how we could possibly have access to other people's thoughts and stuff. How can we communicate with other people? How can we interact with other people at all? George Berkeley had this idea that, oh, by the way, idealism, there are Christian idealists. And so I'm arguing against those people too. George Berkeley was one of them. I think he came after John Locke. And in his view, God was like the ultimate mind. And the reason you perceive the same external world as I perceive is because God is feeding these perceptions into our minds, and he's doing it consistently so that we all perceive the same things. Well, to me, this doesn't really solve the problem, because think about it. Imagine that I have a dream in which I'm having a conversation with you, and you have a dream in which you're having a conversation with me, and it's the same conversation. In that case, obviously the fact that we're having the same dream doesn't mean we're really communicating with each other. I'm just having a subjective experience that just happens by luck to be the same subjective experience you're having. But we're not interacting with each other. And so if it happens that God, it just happens to be feeding the same information into both of our minds at the same time, doesn't mean that we're actually perceiving the same thing. And it doesn't mean we're interacting. Because if you think about it, God could feed those perceptions into your mind without me even existing, and vice versa. And so my existence really has nothing to do with what's going on in your mind when we're supposedly having a conversation together, or when we're both looking at the same tree or whatever. So really, if idealism is true, we're all alone. You can push this analogy a little bit farther. Imagine if I'm having a perception of having a conversation with you today, and 20 years from now, you have that exact same perception. So now we're separated by time, but we wouldn't ever know that. And yet, so obviously, I mean, if we're separated in time, we can't possibly be interacting with each other unless we're like interacting through time, where it's like communication going forward and backward through time. Seems unlikely. And so for all these reasons, I reject idealism. I reject it because it really, it flies in the face of our rational intuitions. It flies in the face of our rational intuitions about other minds and our access to them, the fact that we're having conversations with people. And it flies in the face of our intuition that our senses correspond to a real external world. And so for those reasons, I reject idealism. And you can read more about it in my blog post that I'm going to link in the description. And there you have it. So the next time, I guess I'm going to talk about physicalism. I may talk about physicalism and dualism at the same time, because some of my arguments against physicalism kind of lead to dualism. So I don't really know how I'm going to separate the two things. But I guess maybe you could think of it as we got three options. We can eliminate one of them, idealism. And then we can, so now we're just left with physicalism and dualism, and I don't know. You'll see. We'll see how it goes.